So this video is meant to demonstrate how to install an exhaust fan into a Lenovo ThinkCentre M93p small form factor PC. This tiny case has an air intake, and it also has a fan on top of the CPU heatsink, but there's no exhaust. There's nothing drawing the air out. So as you may have seen in a previous video, I've upgraded this particular desktop to have instead of an i5, an Intel i7-4770 CPU. I've installed 24 gigabytes of DDR3 Corsair Vengeance RAM, and I've also installed a GT 1050 small form factor graphics card with the idea to make a kind of an incognito or a discrete gaming tower in this little black case. And it works really well, but I did notice the temperatures go way up to the 90s, and things get really hot in there. I've noticed that hot air is just swirling around. It's not really escaping, so I had the idea to install an exhaust fan, and of course that's a little bit difficult in a model like this. I started off by splicing a fan power cables to a USB and feeding the cables through some of these honeycomb holes to the USB port, and that worked. The thermals got way better and everything operated really great, but I wanted to improve on it. Instead of having something sticking out the rear of the computer, even if it's hidden, I didn't like. I really liked the mod, but I didn't like how it looked vanity-wise. Even if you have this thing facing the back of facing the wall or something, or away from plain sight. And also, I would like to have all access to USB ports. So I realized that I now have a fan with a cable long enough to reach from the rear all the way to the extra system fan port on the motherboard, as I'll show you in a minute. So I've shifted from splicing this thing in, which I only had a really short cable, maybe about that long. I believe this was an old CPU fan. It was just what I had laying around at the time. Splicing this, I was going to splice it with a SATA Y power splitter, but we're going to bypass all that. It's an interesting modification, but I do plan to sell this, and it'd be kind of nice to sell it without my funny splicing job, no matter how unique or interesting it is to me. For a consumer, it could be a liability, or it could start a fire. So anyways, let's get this thing open and I'll show you what I'm going to do. So amongst this mess of cables, there is a system fan header right here. And that's what we're going to be plugging our fan into instead of splicing into a different power source. And I've already tested this fan, which came out of a Lenovo ThinkCentre M92p, I believe. Similar machine, but with a Intel 3rd generation i5 instead of 4th generation. So I originally took it out because I thought it was making a little bit of noise, and it turns out that I believe it was the CPU fan in that tower. Well, anyways, it's a long story short, we're going to use it today. And two brackets that I previously created for this tiny CPU fan right here, I'm going to reuse those, and we're going to mount this fan in the rear of the case, sitting here just like that, and we'll be able to screw these in from the rear and have the fan sit here and blow hot air out of the tower. It would be quite So one thing with this fan is that there's nowhere for me to drill in. I originally had two of these brackets in the other CPU fan, and the screw was going down on either end because there was just some extra plastic casing to dig into. In this case, there isn't. I would either need a long screw and drill in at a bit of an angle over here, but there's just less plastic on this thing, which is kind of good for the environment, I suppose, but bad for me. So what I ended up doing was taking my metal snips and chopping a thin slice out of the bracket, and I'll feed it through the screw holes of this instead, and I can either bend this down and fasten it that way, or I'll add a little bit of adhesive, maybe some electrical tape stuffed in the middle there just to hold everything in place and make sure it's not jerking around too much. Whatever I can do to fasten is good, so that is my solution for the time being. And luckily, even though this case fan is a little bit bigger than my CPU fan, it still fits just fine as long as I bump it up right against the rear I/O connected to the motherboard. There's a nice little space here between some capacitors and the what looks like the rear display I/O and the serial port. So I'll videotape me preparing the brackets, and then we'll get to installing the fan. So check this out. A lot of fans have this printed on the side, which indicates the direction of the fan spinning and also the direction that the air is going to be going. So in this case, we have an arrow pointing this way and an arrow pointing this way. That would indicate that we want this side of the fan showing the specifications. We want that facing the rear of the case so we know for sure that air is going out of the machine. With low-powered fans like this, sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell, even when, say, like lick your finger and put it in front of the fan. When the air is drawing in, you might feel kind of like the illusion of a breeze coming out, but in fact the air is going this way. And anyway, it just really helps to have a arrow indicating that, so I thank the manufacturers of whoever made this fan. I know Foxconn perhaps made the motor. Maybe they made the entire fan assembly as well, so I thank them. Alright, so I was a little bit concerned about all the movement and play with this bracket, especially when you're moving the case up and down, standing upright or laying down. I don't want the fan to be all askew or falling out of place, or worst case scenario, coming out altogether. So what I did was take one of the original screws that I had drilled into the CPU fan, and I fastened it into the rear of the fan right up against the metal bracket here, and that is keeping it in place nice and solid. So I'm gonna do that with the other one, with the other side. It's a quick fix. So if you do this yourself, just make sure that the screw is not too skinny and that there's enough of a diameter for the screw to chew into the plastic as well as the metal. Perfect. Alright, I think we're ready to mount this in the back. plug it in, and give it a go. So originally I had drilled holes into the bracket, which I'll show in little clips here, and that allowed me to fasten these screws into these brackets. Again, you'll need to use a smaller drill bit than what you have, like a smaller drill bit than the screws, just so you know they'll fasten in nice and tight and won't sit there all loose. Alright, so let's get this thing in. And luckily these little honeycomb holes are just big enough for the screw to fit into. And you can kind of pick the placement. In this case it fits about the best right here. There's our exhaust fan, sitting right where we had the previous CPU fan. And now you'll notice the grill, the honeycomb grill back here is not the exact width of any fan that I've put in. However, there's enough ventilation here to get hot air out from the CPU here. And there's a extra little hole here for, I believe, what might have been PS2 ports on a different model, or maybe they reused this I/O or something, this I/O shield, I don't really know, but there's this little hole here too. It's small, but it's something. You could remove that, but I think I'd like to keep it as clean looking as possible, with these two screws being enough of a distraction vanity-wise. So now the time has come to feed the cable, and again with these small form factor cases, my urge to cable manage is just somewhat defeated by the state of the cables that this comes from the manufacturer. Cables are everywhere in these machines, from Lenovo, Dell, HP, you name it. There's a little bit of management in these little clips around the case itself, but largely it's just going to be a big spaghetti. So I'm going to just feed this through here and tuck it into a couple little cable ties that are existing, and at the very most, or at the very least rather, just keep it away from any moving parts so it doesn't get caught in the fan or something like that. So to do that, I might actually tie these two fan cables together and kind of tuck it around the CPU fan, just like this, just to keep them out of the way, or tie them into the CPU power cable. Keep them nice and tight, and they won't hit this fan here. So we have the cables tied up right here. They'll avoid the spinning fan. And I've just, again, just laid the cable across this mess of cables over here. And we're going to call it a day, because watch this. Hey, just like that. Can't even see those cables anymore. It's like they don't exist at all. Only in my nightmares. So let's get this thing fired up. We'll check out that spinning fan and put the case on and do some testing with some games. Okay, so first boot. Let's hope for the best. Alright, that's pretty nice. I can feel the air coming out. This fan is a lot quieter than this fan. Even when I spin this fan right now, just the bearings feel loose, like the bearings feel dirty or something, and I can hear the noise a little bit. This is relatively silent, just like the CPU fan, and I think we're going to have some good heat dissipating getting out of this case, and it's fit pretty snug too, which is awesome. And I kind of put this over, as you saw, just to see how it would fit, but here's the final. That's awesome. Okay, the lid fits, and check that out. We have an exhaust fan with 2 screws, barely noticeable, and no bulky USB cable coming out and plugging in to a rear USB port. So that is the ideal setup for a discrete gaming machine. So let's test it out with, I'll run the Heaven benchmark, I'll run some Skater XL, I'll run some Tomb Raider, Dead by Daylight, all in a row, and we'll see where the thermals are at when we begin and where we're at in between and when we end. So right now we have the handy CPU ID hardware monitor running in the background, and this is just the initial look. It's only been running for a few minutes, and the temperatures are all completely normal, ranging from 25 to 34 degrees Celsius. For the Intel Core i7-4770 CPU, yeah, everything's normal for the SSDs. More what I'm interested in is the GPU and CPU heat. The GTX 1050, we're ranging between 23.9 to 33.6, which is totally fine. So let's get to some testing. Okay, there's our score. Frames per second average, I guess, of 102.8, which is awesome. I don't know what the score 2591 is based on, but anyway. Minimum frames per second, 27.4, max 203.6. That's awesome, and I can definitely feel warmth coming out of the case itself, so let's check those thermals and see where we're at. Okay, so after running the Heaven benchmark, our peak heat was 59 degrees Celsius on the CPU, and on the GPU, we reached a hotspot of actually 72.7 degrees, which is a little bit up there, but the CPU is way down, and that is still almost 20 degrees cooler than when we didn't have an exhaust fan. Now, it was actually, the thermals were a little bit better with this CPU fan, because it did spin faster, and this fan that we installed, I think it releases less heat, but that's still pretty good overall. So I'm gonna test some games, and we'll report back after each experience, because it'll give us a good idea. Okay, here we have some Skater XL performing very nice. So I'll play this for a little while and I'll get back to you with the thermals. Alright, so after playing Skater XL for about 20 minutes, half an hour, the max temps we got were 64 degrees Celsius on the CPU, and 72.7 still hotspot on the graphics card, so not too bad. Now we'll try Tomb Raider and Dead by Daylight. Okay, so here we have some Dead by Daylight. It's running really well. I have it set to high settings. Okay, after a few matches of Dead by Daylight, we have CPU heat peaking out at 70 degrees Celsius and GPU at 73.4. Not bad. One more game. Alright, so here we have Tomb Raider from 2012, I believe. What I'm going to do is run the benchmark. So instead of playing this game for a little while, I'm just going to run the benchmark and then see where the thermals are at. Okay, it looks like our benchmark stats are minimum of 58 frames per second, max 60, average 59.9. Okay, it's not a very long benchmark, but it tests out the limitations of the hardware on the game. Now, I didn't think that this game would have much trouble running on this hardware. But let's check the thermals anyway. And our thermals for the CPU are peaking again at 70 degrees Celsius. And the GPU, I'm sure... Oh, okay. Around 65 degrees Celsius with the peak heat from before of 73.4 again. So I think I'll leave it at that. I could run Tomb Raider for longer, but I have a feeling after running the Heaven benchmark, playing Dead by Daylight, Skater XL, and Tomb Raider all in a row, I don't think we're in any danger of overheating, at least with those games and this particular setup. So we'll end this off with a, where's the PC? There it is. We'll end this off with some final thoughts and a little bit of a wrap up. So we managed to turn what looks like a random office PC into a fairly good performance gaming computer. With the addition of hardware and the exhaust fan, yeah, I'm really impressed. I think even though I want to keep this just for the novelty alone, I think I'm going to price it out and sell it on budget, and somebody else can get a good start with PC building or use it as a placeholder until they can afford higher tier hardware. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching, and if you have any feedback, leave it in the comments below and we can chat there, and you can let me know what you plan to do or what you've already done with your M93p. Okay, thanks a lot for watching.